Hello! We are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are tackling a feeling that stops many of us before we even start, the morning slump. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through building a routine that stops laziness in its tracks.
And I'm Abel. I'm so glad to be here with you, Anna. We all have those mornings where we just want to stay in bed and do nothing. Today we want to talk about how to use English to reset your energy and start your day with purpose instead of hesitation.
That is exactly right, Abel. And I want to begin by saying something that I think will surprise many of our listeners. The feeling we call laziness is not always what we think it is. Most people use that word to describe themselves in a very negative way. They say, I am lazy, I have no willpower, I cannot get out of bed. But what they are actually experiencing, in most cases, is not a character flaw. It is a physiological state. It is a condition of the body and the brain that can be changed with the right approach.
That's really interesting, Anna, because I definitely call myself lazy all the time. Every morning my alarm goes off and I just lie there. I'm not asleep anymore, but I'm not awake in the way I need to be. It feels like my body weighs 1,000 kilograms and the bed is a magnet. Is that what you mean by a physiological state?
Yes, that is a perfect description, Abel. What you are describing is a state called sleep inertia. It is the grogginess, the heaviness, the difficulty in transitioning from sleep to full wakefulness. Your brain is still producing chemicals that are associated with rest. Your core body temperature is still low. Your cortisol, which is the hormone that helps you feel alert and energized, has not yet reached its peak level for the day. So, when you lie there feeling heavy and unmotivated, you are not being lazy. Your body is literally finishing a biological process. The problem, however, is when we make choices in that state that extend that feeling far beyond what is necessary.
So you're saying there's a difference between the initial heaviness, which is natural, and then something else that we do that makes it worse and keeps us stuck.
Exactly. And this is the most important distinction we want to make today. There is a difference between physical rest, which is something the body genuinely needs, and what I call lazy habits, which are the behaviors we choose that prevent the body from completing its natural waking up process. Your body needs a few minutes to transition from sleep to full alertness. That's normal. But if you use those minutes to scroll through social media, to lie still in darkness, or to press snooze repeatedly, you are not giving your body a chance to complete that transition. You are actually sending it signals to go back to the resting state. You are fighting against your own biology.
Oh, that explains so much. I press snooze at least 3 or 4 times every morning. I always thought I was getting more rest, but actually I'm just making myself feel worse. Is that what's happening?
That is precisely what is happening. Each time you press snooze, your brain begins a new sleep cycle, and when the alarm rings again just a few minutes later, you're waking up in the middle of that cycle, which produces even deeper feelings of grogginess than if you had simply gotten up the first time. So the snooze button is, in a very real sense, a machine for producing more lethargy. It feels like kindness to yourself, but it's actually the opposite.
I never thought about it that way. So the morning is not just about getting enough sleep the night before. It's also about how you handle those first few minutes after you wake up.
Correct. And this is why the morning is so strategically important, not just for your energy, but for everything you want to accomplish, including your English learning. What you do in the first 20 to 30 minutes after waking up sets the neurological tone for the entire day. Think of it like the beginning of a piece of music. If the first notes are slow, uncertain, and dissonant, the whole piece feels off. But if the opening is clear, deliberate, and purposeful, everything that follows builds on that foundation. Your brain is incredibly sensitive to early morning cues. It's looking for signals from you. Are we resting today, or are we active? The signals you send in those first minutes have a disproportionate influence on the rest of your day.
That's such a powerful image, Anna. I want to talk about something you mentioned earlier about getting started being the hardest part, because for me, once I'm actually up and doing things, I feel fine. It's just that first moment of getting up that feels impossible. Why is that?
What you are describing is one of the most well-documented principles in both physics and behavioral psychology, and it's called inertia. In physics, inertia is the tendency of an object to resist a change in its state. An object that is at rest wants to stay at rest. An object that is in motion wants to stay in motion. This principle applies to human behavior in a remarkably accurate way. When you are lying in bed, you are an object at rest. Your body, your mind, your habits are all in a resting state, and to change that state, you need to overcome a force of resistance. That force feels enormous in the moment. It feels like it requires everything you have. But the extraordinary thing about inertia is once you overcome it, once you begin moving, the resistance drops dramatically. The energy required to keep moving is far less than the energy required to start moving.
So the actual act of getting up, of putting my feet on the floor, is the moment that requires the most energy. Not the whole morning routine, but just that one single first action.
Yes, just that one action. And this is why the advice, just get out of bed, sounds simple, but is actually profoundly strategic. Once your feet are on the floor, the inertia is broken. Your body is now an object in motion, and objects in motion want to stay in motion. Everything that follows, brushing your teeth, making coffee, getting dressed, becomes progressively easier because you have already overcome the hardest part. The key insight here is that the barrier is at the beginning, not at the middle. Most people feel like they need to feel motivated before they start, but the science tells us the opposite. Motivation comes after you start, not before.
Okay, so we start and then we feel the motivation. That's a real shift in how I think about it. Now, I know you want to talk about how English learning fits into all of this. Can you explain how a simple English routine in the morning helps reduce the energy needed to start?
This is where the concept becomes truly exciting for our listeners because English learning and morning energy management are deeply connected. When you engage with English in the morning, even in a very small way, you are doing several things simultaneously. First, you are activating a different part of your brain, the language acquisition center, which requires conscious attention. And conscious attention is a signal to the brain that says, we are awake and we are engaged. It is a more powerful signal than simply moving your body. Second, you are creating what psychologists call a behavioral anchor. A behavioral anchor is a specific action that your brain associates with a particular mental state. If you consistently listen to an English podcast while you make your morning coffee, your brain begins to associate the smell of coffee, the act of pouring water, the sound of the kettle, with the feeling of English engagement. Over time, the ritual itself triggers the mental state you want.
That is wonderful. So the English routine becomes part of the physical routine and they reinforce each other. But Anna, I want to ask about something that is the opposite of that for many people, and that is the phone. Because my phone is the first thing I reach for every morning, and I know you want to talk about why that is a problem.
This is perhaps the most critical habit to address, Abel, because smartphone use in the first moments of the morning is one of the most powerful anchors for the feeling of lethargy, even though it feels like the opposite. When you pick up your phone and open social media, news apps, or messaging platforms, your brain receives an immediate flood of dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical associated with reward and pleasure. It feels good in the moment. It is stimulating. But this kind of stimulation is what I call passive stimulation. You are consuming content that other people have created. You are reacting to things. Your brain is being entertained, but it is not being activated in a purposeful way. And this creates what I call digital lethargy.
Digital lethargy. That is a new phrase for me. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Digital lethargy is the state where your brain feels busy but is actually passive. You are spending mental energy on content that does not require effort, does not produce anything, and does not move you forward. The problem is that this state uses up a significant portion of your morning alertness without giving you anything in return. By the time you put down your phone, 20 or 30 minutes have passed. Your cortisol peak has started to fade. You have consumed a large quantity of emotional information, news, other people's opinions, arguments, highlights of other people's lives, and your brain is now processing all of that emotional content before you have even had breakfast. You arrive at your own day already tired from other people's days.
That is a very striking way to put it. Arriving at your own day tired from other people's days. I feel that so strongly. So what is the alternative? What should we do instead of reaching for the phone?
The alternative is to replace passive English consumption with active English input. And the distinction between passive and active is extremely important here. Passive input is when you scroll and absorb without intention. Active input is when you choose what you listen with attention, and engage your brain in processing real language. Listening to a slow English podcast, like this one, is active input. Reading a short paragraph in English and thinking about what it means is active input. Narrating your own actions in English as you move through your morning is active input. All of these things stimulate the language acquisition center of the brain, produce a sense of purposeful engagement, and create momentum rather than draining it.
I love the idea of narrating your own actions. Can you tell us more about that? You called it a 3-minute warm-up. How exactly does that work?
The 3-minute English warm-up is one of my favorite techniques because it requires no materials, no preparation, and no special skills. All it requires is your voice and your attention. Here's how it works. As you perform your first 3 morning actions, you narrate them in English, either out loud or in your head, but out loud is better. So, for example, you wake up and your first action is to get out of bed. You say to yourself, I am getting out of bed. I am pushing the blanket aside. I am putting my feet on the floor. The floor is cold this morning. I am standing up slowly. I feel a little stiff in my shoulders. Your second action might be walking to the bathroom. You say, I am walking to the bathroom. I am turning on the light. The light is very bright. I am looking in the mirror. My hair is messy. I look tired, but I am awake. Your third action might be making coffee. You say, I am filling the kettle with water. The water sounds loud in the quiet morning. I am putting the kettle on. I am taking my cup from the cupboard. It's my blue cup, my favorite one.
I love that example, Anna. It is so simple but so specific. I can actually imagine doing that. But why does speaking like that in English help wake up the brain? Is it just because you are using language, or is there something more specific happening?
There is something very specific happening, and it has to do with how the brain processes language versus how it processes automatic behaviors. When you perform an automatic behavior, like getting out of bed or turning on a tap, your brain uses a very minimal amount of conscious attention. These are habitual motor programs that run on almost autopilot. But when you narrate those actions in a language that you are still learning, your brain must work consciously. It must retrieve vocabulary. It must construct grammar. It must connect words to the sensory experience in front of you. This conscious work activates the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain associated with focus, decision-making, and intentional action. Activating the prefrontal cortex early in the morning is like turning on the engine of a car. Once it's running, everything else can operate from that power.
That is a beautiful explanation. So the narration is essentially using English as a tool to force the brain into a conscious, wakeful state. And at the same time, you are practicing your English. You are getting 2 benefits from one simple action.
Exactly. And this is the philosophy behind everything we discuss on the English journey. We believe that English learning should not be a separate activity that you add to your day. It should be woven into your daily life in such a way that living your life and learning English become the same activity. The morning narration is a perfect example of this philosophy. You are not finding extra time for English. You are simply changing the language of your inner experience during activities you are already going to do.
I want to come back to something we touched on earlier, which is the idea that laziness is often about energy rather than character. Because I think many of our listeners, and I include myself in this, feel a lot of guilt about their mornings. They feel like a bad person because they cannot get up, or because they waste time, or because they feel sluggish. What would you say to someone who is struggling with that guilt?
I would say to that person that guilt is one of the least useful tools for behavioral change. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that shame and self-criticism reduce motivation rather than increase it. When you tell yourself you are lazy, you are creating a fixed identity around that characteristic. And once you believe something is part of your identity, you stop trying to change it. You think, I am just a lazy person. This is who I am. But if instead you say, I am a person whose energy levels are low in the morning, and I'm learning how to manage that better, you have shifted from a fixed identity to a growth process. That shift is enormously important.
That reframe is so liberating, Anna. From I am lazy to my energy is low and I'm working on managing it, it removes the moral judgment from the equation entirely.
And once you remove the moral judgment, you can see clearly what is actually happening. In most cases, what people call laziness in the morning is really just a fuel problem. Their body and brain do not have the right kind of fuel to begin. And there are several reasons this might be true. They may not have slept well, they may not have eaten well the evening before, they may be mildly dehydrated because the body loses water during sleep, and even mild dehydration produces feelings of fatigue and difficulty concentrating. They may be overwhelmed by everything they need to do in the day ahead, and their brain is actually protecting itself by refusing to engage with all of it at once. All of these are energy and resource problems. They are not problems of character or willpower.
So when you say managing energy rather than managing time, you mean that the real question in the morning is not, how do I use every minute productively, but rather, how do I restore and activate the right kind of energy to function well?
That is a very precise summary, Abel. Time management is a concept that assumes you have consistent energy throughout the day, which is simply not how human biology works. You do not have the same capacity at 7 in the morning after poor sleep as you do at 10 in the morning after a good night's rest, a glass of water, some movement, and a meaningful activity. Energy management means understanding your own rhythms, knowing when your focus is sharpest, knowing what depletes you and what restores you, and designing your morning in a way that builds your energy reserves rather than draining them immediately. Small English tasks like our 3-minute narration or listening to 10 minutes of slow English audio are remarkably effective at providing that kind of fuel because they give your brain something purposeful to engage with. Purposeful engagement produces energy. Passive scrolling consumes it.
Can we talk about how these morning actions connect to a longer-term habit? Because I think one of the biggest struggles for people is not just having a good morning once, but doing it consistently. I've had hundreds of good mornings in my life, but they were always followed by weeks of bad ones. How do we make this stick?
This is the question that sits at the heart of everything, Abel, and the answer lies in understanding the habit loop. The habit loop was described in detail by researchers studying behavioral patterns, and it has 3 components. The first is the cue, the second is the routine, and the third is the reward. The cue is the trigger that initiates a behavior. The routine is the behavior itself, and the reward is the positive feeling that follows, which tells the brain this behavior is worth repeating. Most people understand this framework in theory, but fail to apply it in practice because they focus too much on the routine and not enough on the cue and the reward. Let me give you a very specific example of how to build a morning English habit using this loop.
Please do. I think a concrete example will really help our listeners understand how to apply it.
Of course. So let's say you want to build a habit of listening to 10 minutes of slow English audio every morning. The routine is already defined, listening to the audio. Now we need a cue and a reward. For the cue, you need something that already happens every single morning without exception, something that is completely reliable. A perfect cue is the act of making coffee or tea. Almost everyone who drinks coffee or tea in the morning does so consistently. The act of pressing the button on the coffee machine or putting the kettle on is a cue that is already deeply embedded in your morning, so you attach the new behavior to the existing one. The moment the kettle is on, you put in your earphones and you press play on your English audio. Not after the coffee is ready, not when you sit down, the moment the kettle is on. This is called habit stacking, and it's incredibly effective because you're using the power of an existing habit to carry a new one.
And then the reward? What is the reward that tells the brain this is worth repeating?
The reward must be something genuine and immediate. It cannot be abstract, like I will be fluent in English one day. That reward is too distant for the brain to find motivating on a Tuesday morning when you are tired and the bed is warm. The reward must happen in the moment. One of the most powerful immediate rewards you can use is the simple act of acknowledging your own action. After your 10 minutes of English audio, you pause and you say to yourself, clearly and deliberately, I did that. I showed up for myself today. I am building something real. This might sound overly simple, but research in neuroscience shows that verbal self-acknowledgement activates the reward centers of the brain in a measurable way. Your brain responds to the language you use about yourself. When you tell yourself you did something good, your brain registers that as a reward and tags the preceding behavior as worth repeating.
That's fascinating. So the language itself, the English affirmation you give yourself after the habit, is part of the reward loop. And if you do it in English, you're also reinforcing the language even in that moment.
Precisely. And over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The cue, the kettle, no longer just triggers the desire for coffee, it triggers the desire for English input. The two are associated in your brain so deeply that one automatically calls for the other. And this is when a habit becomes truly automatic. You no longer need willpower to do it. You no longer need to negotiate with yourself in the morning. The behavior simply flows from the cue because the neural pathway connecting them has been reinforced through repetition. This is what discipline actually looks like at its most advanced stage. It does not look like a person gritting their teeth and forcing themselves to do something hard. It looks like a person who simply does not question a behavior anymore because it has become part of their identity and their daily rhythm.
I want to go back to something for a moment, Hannah, because I think our listeners who are learning English might wonder specifically how all of these small habits connect to their actual improvement in English. We have talked about narrating, listening, and affirmations, but do these small things really make a meaningful difference to someone's English fluency over time?
This is a deeply important question, and the answer is a definitive yes, for reasons that go beyond what most people expect. The first reason is that language acquisition is primarily driven by consistent exposure, not intensive sessions. Research by linguists who study second language acquisition consistently shows that learners who engage with their target language in short, frequent sessions outperform learners who study in long, infrequent sessions. Your brain acquires language by encountering it repeatedly in natural contexts, by hearing sounds, patterns, and vocabulary over and over again until they become internalized. A 10-minute morning narration 5 days a week provides 50 minutes of active English production per week. 52 weeks of that is over 40 hours of English speaking practice from one small habit that takes less time than a cup of coffee.
When you put it in those cumulative numbers, it sounds extraordinary. 40 hours of speaking practice just from narrating my morning routine.
And that does not include the listening you do, or the reading, or the affirmations, or any of the other small touch points we have discussed. When you add all of those together, a learner who follows this kind of integrated morning routine is engaging with English for a meaningful amount of time every single day, without ever sitting down for a formal study session. And because the English is connected to real, lived experience, to the sensory details of their morning, the cold floor, the sound of the kettle, the smell of coffee, the vocabulary and structures are encoded in episodic memory, which is one of the most durable forms of long-term memory in the human brain. You remember language best when it is connected to an experience, a place, a smell, a feeling.
So the morning environment itself becomes a kind of classroom, but a living one that you actually inhabit, not an abstract study room.
A living classroom. I love that phrase, Abel. That is exactly what it is. And unlike a formal classroom, this one is always open, it is always personal, and it is always relevant to your actual life. Nobody else's examples, nobody else's sample sentences. Your sentences, your experiences, your English. That kind of personal relevance is irreplaceable in language learning.
Anna, as we approach the end of our time together today, I want to ask you to bring everything we have discussed together. We have talked about inertia, about digital lethargy, about the 3-minute narration, about energy management, about the habit loop, and about how these connect to real English improvement. If a listener is going to walk away and try one thing tomorrow, what is the single most important idea you want them to carry with them?
The single most important idea is this. Intentionality is the opposite of inertia. Every morning, you have a choice in the first 30 seconds after you wake up. You can let the inertia of rest carry you back into passivity, or you can introduce a single deliberate intention. You do not need a perfect morning routine. You do not need to transform your life overnight. You need one intentional act. Put your feet on the floor. Say one sentence in English. Notice the world around you and name it in the language you are building. That one act of intentionality breaks the inertia, and once the inertia is broken, motion is possible. And once motion is possible, everything else follows. English fluency is not something that happens in a classroom or during a test. It is something that grows in the quiet, deliberate moments of an ordinary morning, one narrated action at a time.
And I would add this from the perspective of someone who has struggled with exactly what our listeners are struggling with. The mornings when you follow through, even imperfectly, even when you feel heavy and slow, those are the mornings that build the version of you who no longer needs to struggle because the habit has already done the work for you.